Calaroga Shark Media.
March 2nd, 1939. White smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel as the cardinals announced their choice for the new pope. Eugenio Pacelli, who took the name Pius the Twelfth, was a brilliant diplomat who had spent years negotiating with European governments. He spoke fluent German, understood European politics better than perhaps any man alive, and seemed perfectly suited to guide the Catholic Church through the growing crisis in Europe. Within 6 months, the world would be at war. Within 3 years, Nazi Germany would be systematically murdering millions of Jews across occupied Europe, and the Pope, who had been elected to provide moral leadership in humanity's darkest hour, would remain largely silent while the Holocaust unfolded before his eyes. Pius the Twelfth's wartime conduct would become one of the most controversial legacies in papal history. His defenders argue that he saved hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives through quiet diplomacy and behind-the-scenes intervention. His critics claim that his silence in the face of genocide made him complicit in the greatest crime of the 20th century. This is White Smoke, Episode 37, The Nazi Pope. The question haunts Catholic consciousness to this day. When faced with ultimate evil, did the Vicar of Christ speak truth to power, or did he choose institutional preservation over moral courage? Today, we examine the most controversial papacy of the modern era, when silence became as significant as speech and papal neutrality faced its ultimate test. Eugenio Pacelli's path to the papacy had been shaped by decades of diplomatic service that taught him to value prudence, discretion, and institutional survival above all other considerations. As papal nuncio to Germany from 1917 to 1929, he had witnessed the collapse of the Kaiser's regime, the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and the rise of extremist movements that threatened traditional European civilization. Pacelli's diplomatic experience had convinced him that the Catholic Church's survival depended on maintaining neutrality in political conflicts while negotiating practical arrangements with whatever governments happened to be in power. This approach had served the Church well during the upheavals following World War I, when papal diplomacy had protected Catholic interests across a continent torn by revolution and civil war. The Reichskonkordat of 1933 represented both the triumph and the tragedy of Pacelli's diplomatic philosophy. As Vatican Secretary of State, he had negotiated this treaty with Adolf Hitler's government, securing legal protection for Catholic schools, organizations, and clergy in exchange for the Church's withdrawal from German political activity. The Concordat seemed to provide the institutional security that Pacelli considered essential for Catholic survival in Nazi Germany. Catholic schools would continue operating, priests would be protected from persecution, and the Church would maintain its organizational structure even under totalitarian rule. From a narrow institutional perspective, the agreement appeared to be a diplomatic masterstroke. Yet the Concordat also legitimized Hitler's regime in the eyes of many German Catholics who had been uncertain about supporting the Nazis. The Vatican's willingness to negotiate with Hitler suggested papal acceptance of Nazi rule, encouraging Catholic cooperation with a government that was already showing signs of its criminal intentions. More critically, the Concordat's requirement that Catholic clergy avoid political activity effectively silenced the Church's voice at the moment when moral witness was most desperately needed. The institution that should have provided leadership against Nazi ideology had voluntarily muzzled itself in exchange for legal protection. Pacelli's election as Pope Pius the Twelfth in March 1939 coincided with the final collapse of European peace. Within months of his coronation, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, triggering the World War that would test every principle of Catholic moral teaching. Pius's response to the outbreak of war revealed his fundamental commitment to papal neutrality, regardless of the moral implications involved. His first encyclical, Summi Pontificatus, condemned the invasion of Poland in general terms, while carefully avoiding any specific criticism of Nazi aggression or ideology. This pattern of moral equivocation would characterize Pius's entire wartime papacy. When confronted with specific atrocities, he would issue general condemnations of violence without identifying perpetrators or victims. When pressed to speak more directly, he would cite papal neutrality and the need to protect Catholics in Nazi-occupied territories. The systematic persecution of European Jews presented Pius with the ultimate test of papal moral authority. Beginning in 1941, Nazi Germany implemented the final solution, a coordinated program to murder every Jew in Europe. This was not merely another episode of historical anti-Semitism, but an unprecedented attempt at genocide that required immediate and unambiguous moral condemnation. Reports of mass murder reached the Vatican through multiple channels throughout 1942 and 1943. Catholic clergy in Poland reported mass executions in the ghettos. Diplomats provided detailed accounts of deportations to death camps. Jewish leaders pleaded directly with the Pope for public condemnation that might slow the killing. Pius's response was consistent silence. When pressed by Allied governments to speak out against Nazi atrocities, he cited the need for papal neutrality and expressed concern that public condemnation might provoke even worse persecution. When Jewish leaders begged for papal intervention, he provided vague assurances of concern while avoiding any public statement that might identify the Church with Allied war aims. The most devastating example of papal silence came during the deportation of Rome's Jews in October 1943. Under the Pope's very windows, Nazi SS troops rounded up over 1,000 Roman Jews for deportation to Auschwitz. The operation lasted from early morning until afternoon, conducted in full view of Vatican City. Pius knew exactly what was happening. Vatican officials watched the roundup from their windows. The Pope could have walked onto his balcony and condemned the operation before the international press. A single papal statement might have saved hundreds of lives and demonstrated Catholic solidarity with persecuted innocents. Instead, Pius remained silent. The deportation proceeded without papal protest. Over 800 Roman Jews died in Auschwitz, while the Vicar of Christ said nothing about their fate. Pius's defenders argue that his silence was actually a form of effective action, pointing to the many Jews who found refuge in Catholic institutions throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. Convents, monasteries and churches did indeed shelter thousands of Jewish refugees, often at considerable risk to the Catholic personnel involved. Yet this rescue activity, however admirable, cannot excuse papal silence about the systematic murder of millions. Individual acts of courage by ordinary Catholics, priests and nuns should be celebrated, but they do not absolve the Pope of his moral responsibility to speak truth about ultimate evil. The argument that public condemnation would have provoked worse persecution fails to convince when measured against the actual scale of Nazi crimes. It is difficult to imagine how the Holocaust could have been worse than it was, and papal silence certainly did nothing to mitigate its horror. More importantly, this argument assumes that institutional preservation was more important than moral witness, a calculation that contradicts the most fundamental principles of Christian teaching. The Pope, who remained silent to protect Catholic institutions, forgot that the Church's ultimate mission is prophetic witness rather than institutional survival. Pius's Christmas address of 1942 represented his closest approach to direct condemnation of Nazi atrocities. Speaking of the hundreds of thousands who, without any fault on their part, sometimes only because of their nationality or race, have been doomed to death or to a slow decline, he seemed to acknowledge the Holocaust while avoiding any specific identification of victims or perpetrators. Yet even this veiled reference was so abstract and diplomatic that it failed to provide the moral clarity that the situation demanded. The Pope, who spoke of hundreds of thousands when millions were being murdered, who mentioned nationality or race when Jews were being specifically targeted, demonstrated the bankruptcy of diplomatic language when confronted with ultimate evil. The post-war period would see systematic efforts to rehabilitate Pius's wartime record through emphasis on his private rescue activities and diplomatic interventions. The legend of the Pope who saved the Jews emerged gradually based on anecdotal evidence and selective documentation that ignored the larger pattern of papal silence. Yet the historical record is clear. When faced with the greatest moral crisis of the 20th century, the Pope chose institutional caution over prophetic witness. The man who claimed to speak for God remained silent while God's chosen people were systematically murdered by a regime that he had legitimized through diplomatic recognition. Pius the Twelfth's legacy forces Catholics to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between institutional authority and moral responsibility. Can papal claims to spiritual leadership be reconciled with such complete moral failure when confronted with ultimate evil? The Pope who remained silent during the Holocaust demonstrated that even the highest religious authority can fail catastrophically when institutional considerations override moral obligations. His example serves as a permanent reminder that religious leadership means nothing without the courage to speak truth, regardless of political consequences. The controversy surrounding Pius the Twelfth's wartime conduct has prevented his canonization, despite pressure from conservative Catholics who admire his doctrinal orthodoxy and administrative efficiency. The Church that quickly canonized popes of far lesser achievement has been unable to declare saintly a pope whose silence during genocide overshadows any other accomplishments. Yet perhaps this ongoing controversy serves a valuable purpose, forcing each generation of Catholics to examine the relationship between religious authority and moral courage. The Pope who remained silent when millions died reminds us that institutional position means nothing without the willingness to risk everything for fundamental human dignity. The question of whether Pius the Twelfth was Hitler's Pope may be too simple for the complex realities of wartime diplomacy and institutional survival, but the more important question is whether he was Christ's Pope, whether he fulfilled the prophetic mission that defines authentic religious leadership. By that standard, the judgment of history seems clear. When faced with ultimate evil, the Vicar of Christ chose silence over truth, caution over courage, institutional preservation over moral witness. The Pope who should have been the voice of God became complicit through his silence in the greatest crime of the modern era. The tragedy of Pius the Twelfth lies not in his personal malice, which seems to have been absent, but in his failure to understand that religious authority without moral courage becomes complicity with evil. The diplomat who thought he was protecting the Church through prudent silence actually damaged its credibility in ways that persist to this day. His legacy serves as a permanent warning that religious institutions, however ancient and revered, remain vulnerable to moral failure when their leaders place institutional survival above prophetic witness. The silence of Pius the Twelfth echoes still, reminding us that neutrality in the face of evil is itself a form of evil. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration, but still written and produced by real podcasters, Mark Francis and John McDermott.